Okay, so what I'm just aiming to introduce a little bit this morning, first of all, is 4 concepts which I'm going to be using throughout the week, and which I see as central things to work with in the little way. So they're all, well, you might regard them as philosophical concepts, you might regard them as psychological concepts. They're also practical concepts in that they're things we can work with at the same time. So those 4 things which I'm going to talk about are as follows, really. So there's the middle way, which is obviously the central idea that a society uses to represent what we're about. There's the idea of integration. There's the idea of brain lateralisation, or right and left brain, and their relationship. And there's the idea of cognitive biases. So, basically throughout the week I'm going to be talking about different aspects of our experience. And hopefully you may choose to just focus on some of these rather than others, depending on what you find most useful. Yeah, but hopefully you can be able to see how these ideas connect and how they might be useful. So if there's one thing in general about the whole retreat, which I hope you'll take away, it's about how these different concepts can be applied in relation to each other in different areas of life. So this talk, I guess it's going to be a bit of a sketch, really, to begin to give you an idea of how they connect with each other. As regards where they come from, briefly, the middle way, you will obviously recognise as largely known as a Buddhist idea, and that's certainly where I got it from to start with, as in my experience as a practicing Buddhist for about 20 years. Integration largely comes from psychoanalysis, and the thinker who's most influenced me in that regard is Jung, but it's certainly also a concept that's found in other places too. Brain lateralisation are very much influenced by the work of Iain McGilchrist and his book The Master and His Emissary, which is on the table there, and you can have a look at it if you want. And cognitive biases is cognitive psychology, broadly speaking. So the work of, well, a whole range of cognitive psychologists these days, but particularly Daniel Kahneman is the name which has become very well known in this regard. And again, there's one of Kahneman's books on the table there, or his well-known recent book, Thinking Fast and Slow, is a good one to look at to get a sense of the way cognitive psychology presents cognitive biases, or at least some important ones. Okay, so there's different directions where different people have been working on these things, which we're going to try and bring together. So let's start with the middle way, and just the idea of what the middle way is. So middle way, I see as a principle of judgment. That's about both of those words to start with. So it's a principle in the sense that it's something you can refer to as sort of a provisional idea which can guide the decisions you make, or in this case the judgments you make. Now, judgment is something, it's sort of the interface, if you like, between us and the world and our experience. So we're making judgments constantly. You make a judgment when you decide what to have for breakfast. You make a judgment when you decide to walk slightly this way or slightly that way. So judgments can be pretty trivial, or they can be major. You know, well, shall I take this career or that career? So we're talking not just major, very conscious decisions, but also quite minor, maybe unconscious or semi-conscious decisions. of which we may or may not become aware. So the middle way seems to me to be very much about that. It's about how we respond to what we experience, rather than a truth of some kind. So that's where I think there's a major, or I find a major problem or conflict in the Buddhist presentation of the middle way, in that it tends to be presented as a truth discovered by the Buddha about the universe. But if you think of it as a truth, you tend to then, I think, get into conflict with what the middle way is about, which is avoiding beliefs or dogmatic beliefs about truths on either side. So it's a principle of judgment which avoids what one could call metaphysical beliefs. Now, those metaphysical beliefs can be on either side, so what puts them on either side, as it were, is that they may be positive or negative. They may be denying something, or they may be asserting something. And that's really the only difference between positive or negative and negative metaphysical beliefs. So, the classic philosophical examples like the world exists, the world doesn't exist, God does exist, God doesn't exist. But there can be relatively minor ones like it could be any belief that you get fixed on, which becomes dogmatic, which you then absolutize and defend to yourself, like I must have coffee at breakfast time or something like this. That could become a belief that becomes fixed in that way. So the principle of judgment involves resting with your experience and avoiding dogmas on either side. I can see that illustrated, if you want some connection to the Buddha and his life, particularly in the early life of the Buddha. The Buddha adopted an experiential approach. He first of all, he left his family where he had a very secure, a conventional context in which everything was set out for him. And there were just conventions, the expectations of his family provided one kind of absolute set of beliefs and assumptions. So he went forth from that, he abandoned that, he went out into a realm of uncertainty in the jungle, according to the story, trying to discover another way of doing things, but he then encountered other sorts of certainties in the jungle, so he found holy men who had certain teachings which he found useful to some degree, but he couldn't adopt those as absolutes either. He didn't find that those completely answered the quest or fulfilled the quest that he felt he was on. So, in the end, he needed to find a way forward in his own experience, avoiding the certitudes on either side. So that's a little bit about the middle way to start with. Now, just to relate this to some of these other concepts, the concept of integration, as opposed to the middle way, rather than avoiding things, is about bringing them together. So it's much more positive in its emphasis, but it can work in a way that it can complement the middle way. So what you're doing with integration is finding similarly opposed ideas in your life, things that you think are true or false, or that you might hang on to and absolutize on either side. But this time, you're concerned with finding something positive in each of those things, because each of these things you may be rejecting in terms of the middle way, when they're absolutized, also do have something to say to you. They have something, they connect to your experience, or they connect to other people's experience in some way. So you want to take what's meaningful from those opposed principles and make use of them. So let's just call them X and Y, whatever the two things are that you're trying to integrate. Yeah. So on the one hand, X has meaning for me, which means it relates to my life. I have the things I want to do in relation to it, some things I want to achieve, perhaps, the beliefs I have about it. But there may be opposed things which I don't find meaningful, or I don't relate to, or I don't have any desires about. So why does it not? So this could be. Let's take it. Give this a bit more concrete. Supposing it's about trying to give up chocolate because you're eating too much chocolate. So chocolate has a lot of meaning for me. I crave chocolate. The idea of giving up chocolate doesn't. That's one sort of state of mind one might be in. On the other hand, at other times, why may have meaning for me, and on the other hand, X does not. So I may tack from side to side. At one point I want to give up chocolate. Another thing, I want some chocolate. In order to be able to address that, in order to be able to work with it, you can't just deny the bit of you that really wants the chocolate, otherwise you'll just be going from side to side constantly. You need to integrate those two energies, those two things, those two experiences that have meaning for you at different times, and bring them together. So, first sort of synthesis here, I think, is to try and see how this relates to the middle way. Yeah, so it's only by getting what is helpful and positive about these opposed beliefs on either side, and identifying that and trying to use it, that we can also avoid these fixed dogmatic beliefs that we might also encounter. The two go together. There's a critical sorting involved in both cases. Again, that's something I'm going to try and illustrate through the week, so there'll be a number of examples we'll look at. It's just a sketch for the moment. Then the other two ideas, just include here. Brain lateralisation. Now, that basically just means the different specialisations of the left and right brain, which McGilchrist writes about with clarity and a great deal of scientific reference. So to try and put this in a simplified or straightforward way as possible, we've got the left brain has a tendency to make absolute representations. So this particularly arises from the fact that the left brain evolved our language faculties, our prime language faculties, so the way in which the left brain is able to represent to us or create language for us which represents things, particularly those things that aren't going on at the moment. So if you think about something that's not present, like your house, say, or your parents or something like this, then that's something you're constructing. Now, most of the time we construct things in our minds for a purpose. So there's a close relationship, which I think McGilchrist particularly brings out, between the goals that we have, the instrumentality, if you like, that we have, and those representations that we create. So if you think about an early human beginning to develop those kinds of language abilities, those representational language abilities, perhaps they're thinking about something that will be useful to them that isn't present. So maybe the fact that there are deer in the next valley that regularly migrate. So you can't see those deer, but from previous experience you know that those deer are there. So you've got this idea of those deer, and why are you interested in the deer? Well, because you could go and hunt them. So you're only thinking about those deer. They only become part of this construction that you have of something that isn't present because it's useful to you to do so. And I think that's the kind of way in which our left brain works, and the reason why it gets fixated on things and absolutizes things. So at a particular moment, we have a representation of how things are, and just left to itself, the left brain would have an absolute idea. It would just get fixed on that idea, act on it to try and fulfill its goals. But the trouble is, of course, those representations are often wrong or not quite right or need adjusting. So we need information from elsewhere, from the right brain. So the right brain is what provides us with wider awareness. That wider awareness is not totally non-linguistic. It includes awareness of other ways of expressing things and other ways of representing things that we haven't got it fixed in our left brain at the moment. But it's also linked closely to the senses and the body, and so our awareness of what's going on both outside us and inside us is channeled through the right brain. And so it's the right brain that can link together those different absolute representations of the left brain. So think about different absolute representations through time. So these absolute representations are varying through time in the left brain. At one moment, going back to this previous example, you want to give up chocolate. Half an hour later, I really want some chocolate. So you've got those varying representations, those things you really want, and you've got beliefs about them that tend to get fixed. And by the time you've moved into the different state, you've forgotten about that earlier different state. So if you can maintain awareness of that difference and the fact that our representations change, you can start to create the conditions to unite, integrate those different representations. So that's why I'm suggesting that the right brain is the integrator. So it's the left brain at different times, the left brain that thinks it's got it all sorted out and thinks it's got the complete picture at any one time, that can be integrated via the right brain. So that doesn't mean the right brain is has the ultimate picture either. We still need the left brain. We don't have any kind of picture without the left brain. We need the left brain just as much, but left by itself, it's vulnerable. It needs integration. Okay, so hopefully that can begin to make sense of how brain lateralisation relates to integration. Yeah, that the left brain needs integrating, and then also how it relates to the middle way. So what are the extremes of the middle way? What are these metaphysical beliefs that we might get hooked on? Well, they're the left brain thinking it's got the whole picture at a given time, and maybe then writing that down and saying, oh, well, this is Holy Scripture, or this is the ultimate scientific law, or something of this kind. This is the whole thing, not taking into account the fact that another time it might be different. So even if it seems to be the final truth, even if it fits all the evidence at the moment, that might change. So it's the right brain, it's that wider experience that gives us a critical perspective on this tendency of the left brain to absolutize the picture. So then the final element of these four things I'm trying to bring together, cognitive biases. So cognitive biases tell us about tendencies we have to make mistakes. So blockages, if you like, or ways in which we may not be able to be sufficiently aware or less aware than we might be of what's going on. So in other words, they tell us about representations we may have of the world that are not based on the degree of awareness that they might be based on. So cognitive biases, well, to some extent, they tell us about just ways we're set up, our physical limitations as organisms. So the fact that we have, confirmation bias is sort of a very straightforward example to start with to talk about cognitive biases. Yes, a confirmation bias is just our tendency to have a belief and look for evidence to fit it and not take into account the fact that there may be other evidence we're not looking at that doesn't fit it. Yeah, so we look for evidence to confirm the theories we already have. And that's just exactly what you could say the left brain tends to do all the time. The left brain has a picture which it's trying to absolutize, and if it's not sufficiently informed and integrated with the right brain, then it will, be responsible for or leads to some degree of cognitive bias, whatever that degree is. So to some extent, I'd say all cognitive biases are confirmation bias. The confirmation bias is involved in all of them. So cognitive bias, then we could say, can be split into two elements. Yeah. So in each case, to some extent, it tells us about certain conditions that limit us. So let me give you another example there. So one of the ones I'm going to mention later on this morning is called the primacy effect. So the fact that when we first meet somebody or something, what makes most impression on us is what we see first. Now, in a way, that's just a condition that limits us. That's going to happen. That's liable to always happen to some extent. That's just how our brains work. So the next thing that happens is liable to make slightly less impression, unless it's really remarkable, than what first happened. So as they say in business, first impressions count, and when you walk in the interview room or whatever. So yeah, you can say cognitive biases are conditions that limit us, but that doesn't mean that we can't do anything about them. And so the other element here of cognitive biases is about our response to them, and whether in effect we get stuck in an absolute representation of what's happening. So we can avoid absolute representations in response to that bias. So those absolute representations in response might take us either side of the middle way, so it might be positive or negative. It might be, for example, this is just a force of nature, this cognitive bias. There's nothing we can do about it, so let's just live with it. Assume that we're completely determined by the world around us. That would be one kind of absolute response. Another might be, oh well, now we know about the cognitive bias, we can get rid of it. So to pretend almost that despite the evidence that we're still subject to confirmation bias or primacy effect or whatever it is, that we have got rid of it, that we are free, completely free. So we can't be completely free, but that doesn't mean we're completely determined. We're in an ambiguous, embodied, complicated, middling zone between those two states, between being free and being determined. We can't check that out. We can't prove that we're free or determined. We can just have experience, which tends to tell us that things are middling and complicated when we probe it more deeply. Okay, so cognitive biases are part of the picture of what's pressing us on either side. It's part of the tendency towards metaphysical beliefs we might put them into, and obviously in response to them we need to try and develop a middle way. Okay, so as I said earlier, that's just a sketch for now to try and bring those 4 ideas together. Now I appreciate I've tried to give some examples, but I appreciate it might still be a bit abstract. But hopefully we'll be able to relate them more closely to experience as we go on, and particularly I'll start with something a bit more specific in the later part of this morning. But I expect there might be some questions and responses, maybe even challenges based on what we've got so far. So, any questions or thoughts?
So can you put different religions on a scale of metaphysical beliefs, negative, metaphysical beliefs, positive? So, maybe humanism on one side through to evangelical Christianity on the other side, and then fit them. Is there a scale or something like that?
I wouldn't put it quite like that. I think it's more that that it's more a matter of emphasis. Yeah. So if you took evangelical Christianity as an example, there are a lot of positive metaphysical beliefs which tend to get related to evangelical Christianity. So the belief that Jesus is your saviour and Jesus is the Son of God, and specific to evangelical Christianity will be the belief that you should save everybody else and you have a responsibility to do so. So those are all positive metaphysical beliefs. They're things that are basically they're claims that go beyond our experience. But there are also negative ones. So some forms, particularly fundamentalist Christianity, might deny evolutionary evidence, for example, or interpret it in a pretty narrow way anyway. So you then get into negative metaphysical beliefs which go with the positive ones. Yeah. So in my experience, they're usually interrelated and interdependent in any, if you've got a cluster of metaphysical beliefs held by a particular group, whatever that group is, whether it's religious or political or whatever, there will be some interdependent positive and negative ones, but very often one or the other is more striking. And of course it's also possible, it's the aspiration I have for the Middle Way Society, that a group at least tries to get most of its judgments, its collective judgments, somewhere in the middle. It's attempting to engage with that complex middle ground, rather than taking the easy option, if you like, of getting a certainty on either side as the thing that everybody agrees about and keeps the group together. But that's something I'm going to talk about groups in more detail later on in the retreat, and we can go into more detail about that question of how groups work and how they relate to metaphysical beliefs. It's a very interesting area, I think.
We can look at different types of groups that are under certain headings as well.
We could do that, yeah. But one thing I'd try to discourage is thinking of religion as a kind of blanket term. I'm particularly strong on this because one of the things I teach is religious studies, religious studies. But religion includes metaphysical beliefs, but it's not just metaphysical beliefs. It's not just faith. It's also a lot of practices and other things. It's complex, and symbols. It's a complex phenomenon. But obviously, people tend to think of religious beliefs first when they think of religion.
Robert, there's a question about the lateralisation of the brain hemispheres.
Right.
The way I've perceived what you said is that there seems to be some sort of Berlin Wall between the two hemispheres, and they're not communicating with each other, or they're not working in harmony with each other. Am I wrong about that? Or because I know there's a very strong, very thick neural connection between the two hemispheres at the base of the brain.
Yeah.
What's going on there?
Well, as I say, it's a sketch, so I certainly wouldn't agree there's a Berlin Wall. So I'm sorry if you got that impression. there's a lot of communication. That's the basis of integration, and that's why we're all integrated to some degree. We do relate our representations of the world to our experience, and we learn. Basically, we're capable of learning, and we do so. And everybody does that. Even people with major learning difficulties do that. And animals do that for that matter. So we've got a connection. Yes, it's just how good is that connection? And
what mediates the difference? Why is it good in some people? Why is it good in some people and not so good in others? Or is that the case?
Well, I think obviously there are various conditions at work. So there might be, for example, genetic, or there might be environmental conditions which limit us in that respect, yes. Mm-hmm. But then there's also this ambiguous thing, this stuff we can work with. And when we're working with it, what I think broadly happens, without being able to be as precise as a neuroscientist might, is that there are more neural connections being created. More neural connections. Obviously the right brain, left brain thing is a simplification of a very complex picture that a neuroscientist could give us in more detail and much greater length. But I suppose the other way you might think about this is that the left brain representations are isolated wherever they are in the brain. There's a sort of cluster of neural connections which is not sufficiently, I'm not saying not at all connected, but not sufficiently connected to other
not activated
clusters.
Enough, not in some
in
some sense not activated or
possibly. So there may be potential connections or weak connections that aren't connected sufficiently.
That's helpful.
So in a way, even if some people are very doubtful about McGilchrist's approach, but even if physiologically this is wrong, we can still base this on experience. That I think, as Martin was saying last night, that there are two kinds of experience that we have, which correspond more or less to what McGilchrist is on about. So in the end, I don't think it ultimately depends on the science, but the science has some very interesting things to tell us about it, I think, as far as I understand it.
Just one perspective on that, Peter. My understanding from the book is that both sides of the brain can actually perform a lot of the actions that the other one can. But what's interesting about this neural bridge, it's called the corpus callosum. As our brains over evolutionary time have grown larger, proportionally this corpus callosum has actually grown smaller. And arguably one of the main functions of the corpus callosum is to actually inhibit, so that when one side of the brain inhibits the other, because that side of the brain does it in a more specialised way. But what's also interesting is that the left hemisphere apparently can inhibit a lot more effectively than the right inhibiting the left. And with that idea in mind, the left can become more dominant.
Is there something to do with the limbic system as well then? Is the limbic system the left side of the brain and then the human sort of side is the right side of the brain?
I think it's both, I think.
Because the limbic system is like your fight and flight response, is it? And then,
I think that the fight and flight response may be, this is a bit speculative on my part, but it may be connected to very strong representations. So if you're going to fly from danger or fight danger, you must have a very strong immediate idea. There's a tiger about to jump on you. Do something. So that's very strong left brain thing, isn't it? You've got a strong goal there to save yourself, and you've got a strong representation, which is pretty absolute for you at that moment, that you've got to do something. But obviously that's a source of stress. So there's a whole interesting area of discussion, I think, there about how the left brain relates to stresses and or overbalance in the direction of stress, as opposed to the right brain giving a context and a relationship to the body, which we can think of as bringing about a sort of balance with sufficient relaxation to allow balance to develop in relationship between the hemispheres.
in that context, when you talk about the limbic system, and then you bring the example of escaping from a saber-toothed tiger or something like that, I think there are two different cells you're talking about here, because the self that wants to get away from a saber-toothed tiger is your biological somatic self. So this would apply to any animal wanting to escape from a saber-toothed tiger. The limbic system would come in at that level. Whereas there's also the kind of ego psychological self based in the left-hand side of the brain, which we have, which animals don't have. And that there is also vulnerable to threats, external threats, which we then respond in that kind of limbic type manner to, which is inappropriate really. We haven't really evolved for that purpose, but we apply a lot of value to protecting the ego self in a way which isn't necessarily appropriate. And this is where we have to integrate it back into the right-hand side of the brain, which is difficult because, as you say, the inhibition is very strong to push that ego kind of back into the right side of the brain and use responses which would be more appropriate.
So you're saying if someone is suffering from depression, for example, and beating themselves up, that's their fight-flight system attacking the self in a sense.
Yes, yeah, which isn't appropriate, obviously.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the whole question of ego and self is something we'll return to in a couple of days and look at in more detail. It looks as though Martin might have some interesting things to say about that as well. Yeah. But I suppose briefly for now, I mean, certainly my understanding is that, the left brain produces the ego in a sense. So the part of these absolute representations is me and my interests and my identifications. That's part of the absoluteness we're trying to deal with here.
Could you clarify something about the cognitive biases? In Daniel Kahneman's book, he describes all these biases, but at the end of the book, he comes with a fairly, quite pessimistic conclusion that you can do very little about them. Where is he coming from to have that perspective, and why do you disagree with him?
Well, actually, think about this again. I'm not sure that. I think it's a matter of degree how I disagree with him in that he doesn't seem to think that we can't do anything. He just thinks we can't do much.
Right. Yeah.
So it's the question of how much. So one impression I get is that he doesn't really have experience of use of meditation, for example, or practices which might be more associated with religion or alternative perspectives, perhaps, that he may not have encountered as a cognitive psychologist, which can do things so we can experience ways that, shifts that people make using meditation, for example. So it's partly maybe to do with familiarity with the alternatives. And then also I think there's a whole question about the assumptions you make about the self and whether in effect there is a single self which makes sort of correct judgments about things. And in my experience, many naturalistically inclined scientists tend to make that assumption in the way in which they make judgments about whether we can change. So part of the question of whether we can change depends on how fixed we are to start with. And if we see ourselves as constantly changing but integrable, that leaves a lot more scope for change than if you think that in some way we're fixed, that we have that if in some way we think we are the left brain, if the idea we have of ourselves is assumed to be a true one, then that involves a philosophical assumption at the root of the kind of judgments he may be making. Now, I don't know for sure whether he is or not, but that's just a guess I'm making about where he's coming from.
Okay. What about things like critical thinking as well?
Yeah, again, that's another aspect of practice, I think. That so again, this is really just about joining the dots or bringing together the different perspectives. That a synthetic process, because psychologists concentrate on one way of doing things. They do experiments, for example, to show that cognitive biases are consistently the case, and they do that very well. But then, have they investigated the critical thinking techniques and training that you can have as to, and these ways of working from another direction with cognitive biases? I don't know again how familiar he is with that kind of training. So critical thinking is a type of practice which is more connected to philosophy and the philosophical ways of thinking. And then again, there's the whole spiritual practice area of experience.
Yes, it's quite disconcerting, really, isn't it? You think you're fairly sure about something, and then you know you are not. You can be sure you aren't. It's very, the middle is very difficult, really, in some cases.
Yeah.
I haven't read the books, but where do you think cognitive bias comes from originally? Does that go back to a sort of societal versus nature versus nurture debate, or?
There is a lot of emphasis in the literature on cognitive biases on evolutionary explanations for them, that there were things that were helpful to us at an earlier stage of human development that aren't so helpful now. In a way, I'm not that interested in that area because, to some extent, it might be explanatory, but one can easily get bogged down, I think, in questions about origins, in ways that are not directly relevant to the question of what we do about them or how we work with them now. So, yeah, broadly, I mean, you can, if you read some of the literature, you'll find more detail on those kinds of explanations. But it could be, to do with responses to danger, for example. That there were in previous days there were more direct dangers threatening us more frequently that we have to be alert to and so on, respond to quickly than there are now.
But there's still plenty of dangers around. I think it's important not just in an evolutionary sense, but just in a developmental sense. From being a child and growing up and learning what's dangerous and what's not dangerous, you have to. It's a better survival strategy to, if something has proven to be dangerous once, you then become hardwired to expect that to be dangerous the next time. So you're confirming things and you're getting more and more hardwired as your development goes on. And that's so by the time you're 10 years old, you're pretty hardwired. You know how to respond to most things, and that's a useful thing to do in terms of when buses come past, you don't sort of think, shouldn't I? Is it, you assume that bus is going to run you over as you stand in front of it. So it is very useful to have these cognitive biases, but you have to always then be able to step back into the right brain and sort of think, well, actually, to maintain a level of kind of creativity or be able to vary your response in situations, you have to be able to see that is a bias and not an absolute. And this is, I don't know, as I've gotten older, you realise that you're getting more and more fixed in your views. It's very easy to get fixed in your views, and then you just become a complete robot, and everything you just respond to in a fixed manner because these biases have become so hardwired. Whereas it's useful, from a personal development point of view, to be able to keep standing back and keep moving back into your right brain to see that these aren't necessarily true. They're usually true. I mean, I think my job at work, I find it, because I'm making decisions all the time, every 7 minutes you have to make decisions, and you become incredibly hardwired, and, something walks in, you immediately, you don't take hardly any of the information in, you take it to a very small amount, and you come to a conclusion. 95 times out of 100 you're going to be right, and that's quite a useful thing to get you through the day, but it's not, you have to realise that you're making all these assumptions.
You could get caught out.
Yeah, you can get caught out, yeah.
Good example of this is I found is the negativity bias. Most of the newspapers and the television, the news tends to be negative, and that arguably ties into the idea that you're more receptive to there being a saber-toothed tiger in that valley rather than some nice strawberries in the next valley. But there's actually lots of positive news out there as well. I actually subscribe to a positive newspaper, not just to read the positive news, but to try and get balance.
Yeah, so Rick Hanson, have you read his stuff?
Who, sorry?
Rick Hansen.
No.
You know, I'll check up on his book. But yes, I mean, in the evolutionary terms, he says that, you know, it's much more useful to be looking for negative stuff than good stuff. That's what we have as bias all the time, because survival depends on it, doesn't it?
Yeah, but I guess to summarise that, and I think that's a good point, Martin, that is, would you say, or would you agree that it's basically cognitive biases are adaptations in one context, but move into another one and they may become maladaptations?
Yeah.
So it's about that flexibility and awareness of the fact that we change through time and our content and our situation, our environment changes through time. So therefore, what works in one context may not in another.
And that's interesting because all biological systems, as you say, are useful 90% of the time, but there's 10% of the time when it's not useful, like your immune system, whatever, you know, it's incredibly important and it works very well, but sometimes it doesn't then work well in the right context, and then it goes haywire.
Yeah. Okay, but obviously, you know, we could get into refinements of that kind of explanation, but I think that's the point where explanation starts to become an end in itself, rather than. So I want to keep in mind a practical goal for the exercise in the end. That the explanation may or may not be quite right. If we got a rough idea, maybe that's helpful, but we can't be sure of getting the right explanation.